Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something really fascinating, a bit complex actually. The relationship between two major figures in philosophy and psychology, Ludwig Wittgenstein and William James.
Yeah, it's a really interesting pairing. Wittgenstein, the Austrian thinker obsessed with logic, language.
And James, the American pragmatist, the psychologist. Titans, really.
Absolutely. And the connection, well, it's defined by this strange paradox. We know Wittgenstein studied James's work incredibly closely. Really wrestled with it. The principles of psychology, the varieties of religious experience.
He wasn't just casually reading them.
No, not at all. He saw James, I think, as a fellow traveler in the fight against, empty abstraction, someone describing real human life.
Here's the twist, the thing that makes this deep dive so necessary. One of Wittgenstein's key students, Elizabeth Anscombe, she famously said that if Wittgenstein had read James's big philosophical book, Pragmatism,
he would have hated it.
Hated it, despite deeply admiring James the observer, the describer.
That's the tension, right? That's what we need to unpack. Where did they connect? Because they did on things like practice, experience, rejecting essences. But then where's that hard line, the philosophical divide? And it seems to boil down to something like this. James focused on analyzing psychological phenomena, actual experiences.
While Wittgenstein, especially later on, insisted philosophy's job was different. It was about the logical grammar of our concepts, how we use words.
Exactly. Not the feeling itself, but the rules for talking about the feeling. It's a crucial distinction for understanding this whole uneasy relationship.
Okay, let's start right at the foundation then. How did they think about certainty itself?
Well, Wittgenstein, in his later notes, the ones published as Uncertainty, he wasn't trying to prove we know things. He was looking at those beliefs that just stand fast, things we don't normally question.
I have two hands, or, the earth has existed for a long time, stuff like that.
Precisely. And this was partly a reaction to G. Moore, his contemporary at Cambridge. Moore tried to list these things off as knowledge, as obvious facts we know.
He'd literally stand there and say, here's one hand, and here's another, trying to prove the external world existed.
Right. But Wittgenstein thought Moore was making a fundamental mistake. These foundational beliefs, they aren't facts within our system of knowledge. They are the system. They're the hinges, he called them.
Hinges, okay. Like the hinges on a door.
Exactly. They have to stay put for the door, our whole way of investigating and justifying things to even work. If you start doubting the hinges themselves,
the whole door falls off. The whole system collapses.
Right. You can't investigate whether the hinges are sound using the door they support.
Okay, I see the metaphor. But what makes that so radical? Don't we kind of accept that some things are just starting points?
The radical part is why they stand fast. It's not because they're rationally justified or proven true. Wittgenstein's conclusion is pretty startling. Justification runs out. It ends not in some self-evident truth, but in our acting.
Acting.
Our acting, which lies at the bottom of the language game, he wrote. Our certainty isn't based on reason, it's shown in what we do. The certainty that the Earth existed long before us isn't a conclusion we reach. It's the assumed background for, say, doing geology.
So this bedrock certainty, it's practical, almost instinctual.
He describes it exactly like that.
Yeah.
Animal,
I agree.
Instinctive. It's not based on careful thought. Think about sitting in a chair. You don't calculate the physics each time.
You just sit.
You just sit. Your certainty is in the act itself. It's grounded in our form of life, as he put it. These aren't beliefs we chose. They're the inherited background that makes choosing beliefs possible. They're just there, like our life.
Wow. Okay, that is radical. The foundation of all our reasoning and knowledge isn't itself rational. It's just behavior.
That's the implication. It puts a serious limit on traditional rationalism. And what's really fascinating is how close William James gets to this same idea, but then he takes a different turn.
James said something similar.
Yeah, in Pragmatism, he talks about what he calls the conservative web of belief. Our common sense, the old order of beliefs we already hold.
Right, the idea that we don't just toss out old beliefs easily when something new comes along.
Exactly. James says we're extreme conservatives about our beliefs. When a new fact or idea appears, it has to pass a pragmatic test. It needs to cause the minimum of jolt and ensure the maximum of continuity with everything else we already accept.
So if a new idea requires you to rethink absolutely everything,
we resist it. Even if it seems logical on its own, we protect the core system.
Okay, I can definitely see the parallel there.
Yeah.
Both see this core stability in our belief systems. But you said James missed Wittgenstein's key point.
Yes. Because for James, even this core old order, our common sense, it's still ultimately made up of discoveries, things humanity has learned over time because they worked. Their knowledge, accumulated experience. Ancient truths, maybe, but still truths we've found.
Okay. Whereas for Wittgenstein, these hinge propositions are fundamentally not discoveries. They're not on the path of inquiry at all.
Precisely. They're the path itself, or maybe the bedrock under the path. You don't discover that the world existed 5 minutes ago. That belief is, as Wittgenstein put it, on an unused siding. It's off the main track of investigation. James, the empiricist, sees the framework as built from empirical bricks.
While Wittgenstein, the logician or grammarian, sees it as the ungrounded background needed for any building to happen at all. The rules, not the findings.
Exactly. And understanding this difference helps explain why James's pragmatism faced such hostility back in Cambridge when Wittgenstein arrived. Russell and Moore were fiercely critical.
What was their main beef?
Primarily, it was the pragmatic definition of truth. James famously linked truth with usefulness, what pays. For logicians like Russell and Moore, that sounded horribly subjective and relative.
Yeah, truth isn't just about what's convenient.
Right. Moore had this classic objection. Imagine counting the dots on the back of a playing card just once. Let's say you find there are 42 dots. That's true. But is it useful? Does knowing that pay in any practical sense?
Probably not. So Moore's point was that truth and usefulness can come apart.
Exactly. It highlighted the logical problems with simply equating the two, and yet, and this is the core paradox again, even while Wittgenstein was breathing this anti-pragmatist air in Cambridge, he was personally engaging deeply with James. He read the varieties of religious experience early on.
And apparently found it helpful. He recommended it.
He did. He told Russell it did him a lot of good. And Varieties explicitly uses C.S. Peirce's pragmatist principle that the meaning of an idea lies in its practical consequences.
So he found value in a book steeped in the very pragmatism his Cambridge mentors were attacking. How does that work?
I think it's because he connected with James, the describer, the psychologist, the observer of human life in all its messy detail. Wittgenstein himself was going through intense personal and philosophical struggles, sores, this deep anxiety. He seems to have trusted James's honesty about human experience, even if he rejected James's philosophical framework for explaining it. James felt like a real human being describing real life.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. You mentioned they connected on rejecting essences. That seems like a really important point of convergence.
It absolutely is. And James was doing this way before Wittgenstein formalized it in his later work. Look at Varieties of Religious Experience again. Methodologically, he refuses to give a single, neat definition of religion.
He doesn't try to nail down its core essence.
No, he explicitly says religion has no one essence, but rather many characters which may alternately be equally important. It's too complex for one definition.
So how do we understand it then?
Through its particulars. He uses the analogy of government. What is government? Is it laws, authority, police, armies? It's all of those and more. You don't grasp government by an abstract definition, but by getting acquainted with all the different ways it manifests, all its functions and activities.
Knowing it through examples, through its uses, not a formula.
Exactly. And that's an incredible foreshadowing of Wittgenstein's later concept of family resemblances in the philosophical investigations.
Right, the idea that things we group under one word like games don't necessarily share one single defining feature.
Precisely. They share a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, like the resemblances between members of a family build, features, eye color, gait. There's no single thing common to all, but they're clearly related.
So both James and Wittgenstein were pushing back against this long philosophical tradition of hunting for the hidden essence of things.
They were united in that attack, yes.
Ah.
Focusing on the concrete, the particular, the variety of ways things actually show up in human life and language.
But you said this shared anti-essentialism also leads straight to where they fundamentally split.
It does, because it forces the question, what are we describing when we describe these particulars? And this is where Anscombe's comment about Wittgenstein hating pragmatism really bites. Wittgenstein, in his later phase, became adamant. Philosophy doesn't analyze a phenomenon like the subjective feeling of thinking.
It analyzes the concept.
Yes. The concept of thinking, which means analyzing the use of the word think. Philosophy, for late Wittgenstein, is about clarifying conceptual grammar, the rules of our language games.
Whereas James, he was always the psychologist at heart, wasn't he?
Very much so. He tended to pull logic and concepts back towards empirical observation, towards psychology, take logic itself. How did James explain the seemingly unshakable necessity of logical rules, like 2 + 2 = 4?
How did he?
He grounded it in psychology, in the native structure of the human mind. He literally talks about it being based on the inner forces which have made the brain grow. For James, logical necessity is basically a very stable fact about how our brains are wired.
Okay, so it feels necessary because our brains work that way. That sounds plausible, maybe? Empirically grounded.
It sounds plausible if you're an empiricist. But for Wittgenstein, that completely misses the point of logical necessity. If 2 + 2 + 4 is just a fact about how human brains happen to be built.
Then it's contingent. Our brains could have evolved differently. Maybe 2 + 2 would equal 5.
Exactly. It destroys the necessity that seems essential to logic and mathematics. Wittgenstein argued that concepts aren't empirical findings. They function as rules. They express logic, or grammar.
Rules of the game.
Rules of the language game. These rules are what license necessary connections. They define what makes sense to say. James's purely empirical approach, always looking for the observable cause or correlation, misses this normative, rule-governed aspect of concepts. Logic isn't just how we think, it sets the standard for correct thinking.
So James looks for the psychological mechanism behind certainty, while Wittgenstein maps the grammatical rules for using the word certainty.
That's a good way to put it. James studies the event. Wittgenstein studies the rules for describing the event. It's a fundamental methodological divide.
But despite that huge gap, you mentioned they also shared a methodological turn towards description.
Yes, that's another point of affinity. Both, in their own ways, moved away from grand explanation and towards careful description. James, in Principles, claimed he wasn't introducing new theories, but just describing the stream of consciousness, the flow of experience, what he called psychiciousness.
Just laying it out as it appears.
Right. And Wittgenstein, famously, declared that philosophy should do away with all explanation, and description alone must take its place. Since everything important lies open to view in how we use language and live our lives, there's nothing hidden that needs some deep theoretical explanation.
So just look closely at what's already there.
Look very closely. This led Wittgenstein to characterize his own work, his conceptual investigations, as remarks on the natural history of human beings.
Natural history.
Yeah.
That sounds very observational, almost Jungian.
It does, doesn't it? It emphasizes looking at our actual practices, chatting, ordering, questioning, building as part of our natural way of being, our form of life. Both men, at their best, were masters of describing the fine details of human experience, whether it was James detailing the nuances of feeling or Wittgenstein tracing the subtle uses of word. They agreed on the importance of looking at what we do.
Okay, this focus on what we actually do and experience brings us to some specific psychological areas where they both challenged traditional ideas. Let's start with the self, the I. James went looking for it, didn't he? Inside himself.
He certainly did. In the Principles of Psychology, he undertakes this intensive introspective search for the self of selves, the core subjective agent, the I that does the thinking and feeling.
The experiencer behind the experiences.
Right. James, being the dedicated empiricist and, frankly, a relentless self-observer, tried to pin down this pure ego through careful introspection.
And what did he find after all that searching?
Well, the result's almost anticlimactic, or maybe just radically empirical. He concluded this core active self wasn't some ghostly spirit. It was primarily a feeling of bodily activities.
Bodily activities, like what?
Specifically, subtle movements in the head and throat that accompany thinking and reflection. He talks about feelings of eyeball movements, adjustments in the throat or glottis. That collection of physical sensations was the closest thing he could empirically isolate as the constant core self.
Wait, so the profound philosophical I boils down to a feeling in your throat.
That's basically James's startling conclusion. It shows his absolute commitment to finding an observable phenomenon. If you introspect rigorously for the feeling of self, these bodily sensations are what consistently turn up.
But Wittgenstein wasn't buying that, was he? This is where his critique comes in hard.
Exactly. James's finding, while empirically honest, became a prime example for Wittgenstein of how language can mislead us. This is where he uses that powerful metaphor of the weaver at the empty loom.
Explain that, the empty loom.
Wittgenstein suggested that the philosopher trying to introspectively find the self is like someone sitting at a loom with no threads, just going through the motions of weaving. Because the word self, or I, exists and seems to refer to something, the philosopher assumes there must be some specific, continuous entity or phenomenon, a piece of cloth being woven.
So James By finding those throat sensations was like the weaver proudly pointing to the empty motion saying, "See, I found something."
Kind of, yes. Wittgenstein argued James was misled by the grammar of the word I. He felt compelled to find some introspectable thing it referred to, even if that thing turned out to be quite peculiar, like throat movements. The mistake was assuming I must name a specific, continuous inner experience in the first place.
So for Wittgenstein, I doesn't primarily name a feeling.
No. It functions differently in our language. It's more like a grammatical placeholder, a way we have of indexing experiences and actions to a person within our social practices. It's part of the rules of the language game, not a label for an internal object or feeling.
Okay, so the clash on the interpretation, even if James provided the observation. What about the will, the act of volition? Did they find more common ground there?
Surprisingly, yes. This is a point where Wittgenstein seems to have genuinely learned from James, or at least found his observations useful. Both of them noted something quite odd about ordinary intentional actions.
Which is?
The frequent absence of a distinct, separate mental act of will just before we act.
We don't always feel a little mental push or command.
Often, no. James's classic example is getting out of bed on a cold morning. You lie there thinking about it, maybe dreading it, and then suddenly you just find yourself getting up. There wasn't necessarily a specific moment of, okay, now, an explicit internal command.
Or like reaching for a glass of water while talking.
Exactly. The intention seems embedded in the flow of action itself. Wittgenstein picked up on this. He argued that willing isn't some uniform, hidden mental event that causes action. It's often just the character of the action itself within a specific context, understood through our customs and practices. The idea that there must be a separate act of will is another grammatical illusion, forcing us to hunt for a specific mental phenomenon. James's observations help show it often wasn't there.
Interesting. So James's descriptive work fed into Wittgenstein's conceptual clarification. Now, what about emotions? This leads us to the famous James Lange theory.
Right. Possibly James's most famous contribution to psychology, developed with Carl Lange. And it radically flips the common sense view of emotion.
How so? What's the usual view?
Usually we think, you see something scary, like a bear, you feel the emotion, fear, and your body reacts, you tremble, run. Perception, emotion, bodily expression.
Okay, seems straightforward.
James and Lange reversed the last two. They argued. You see the bear, your body immediately reacts, trembling, heart pounding, muscles tensing. And the feeling of those bodily changes is the emotion.
So, we don't tremble because we're afraid. We feel afraid because we tremble.
We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, as James famously put it. The emotion is the perception of the physiological changes.
That's a wild idea. How did Wittgenstein react to that? He liked the focus on the body, right?
He did find something good in it. He appreciated James's emphasis on the incredibly tight connection between emotion and its physical manifestation, the crying, the posture, the facial expression. Wittgenstein agreed that emotions aren't just abstract inner states, they're deeply embodied.
He even agreed that changing your posture could change your feeling.
Yes, both seem to agree on that. James wrote, "Whistling to keep up courage is no mere figure of speech. Acting brave can make you feel braver." Wittgenstein was sympathetic to the idea that expression and feeling are interwoven.
But there's always a but with these two, isn't there? Where did Wittgenstein disagree?
The disagreement came down to the nature of that connection. For James, the emotion was literally composed of the feelings of the bodily changes. Grief, for instance, is the feeling of the lump in the throat, plus the tears, plus the sagging posture, plus the ache in the chest.
Like it's a bundle of physical sensations.
Exactly. James argued if you could subtract all the bodily feelings associated with an emotion like fear, you'd be left with nothing but a cold and neutral state of intellectual perception. The emotion is the sum of its physical parts.
And Wittgenstein rejected that compositional view.
He did, because again, James was trying to treat a concept, grief, fear, as if it referred to a specific localizable empirical phenomenon or a collection of them. Wittgenstein argued emotions aren't like headaches. They aren't simply located in the chest or throat, even if we do point to our body as if the grief were in it.
So what's the alternative? If crying isn't an ingredient of sadness, what is its relation?
For Wittgenstein, it's a criterial relationship. Crying, slumping, speaking in a certain tone, these are criteria for someone being sad. They are part of the publicly observable basis on which we learn and correctly apply the word sadness. They belong to the grammar of the concept.
Ah, So the behavior isn't a part of the inner feeling. It's part of the evidence or standard we use to identify and talk about the feeling.
Exactly. It's about the rules of the language game surrounding emotion words, not about dissecting an inner experience into physical components. James describes the phenomenology brilliantly, but Wittgenstein redirects the philosophical question towards the logic of our concepts.
This really highlights the different ways they approached philosophy itself. What was the ultimate goal for each of them?
That's another area of deep contrast, reflecting their temperaments. James saw his pragmatic method fundamentally as a tool for resolving disputes, a mediator, an adjudicator.
Trying to settle those endless philosophical arguments.
Right, by asking, what practical difference does it make if this theory is true versus that one? If there's no difference in concrete experience or outcome, the dispute is meaningless. His famous example is the squirrel on the tree.
Oh yes, the man walks around the tree, but the squirrel keeps moving so it always faces him. Does the man go around the squirrel?
James says it depends entirely on what you mean by go round. If you mean pass from north to east to south to west of it, yes. If you mean be in front, then to the side, then behind it, no. Clarify the practical meaning and the interminable metaphysical controversy just dissolves. Pragmatism brings peace through conceptual clarity focused on consequences.
Okay, so James wants peace by resolving disputes practically. Wittgenstein also wanted peace for philosophy, didn't he? But in a different way.
A very different way. Wittgenstein saw philosophy not as resolving disputes between theories, but as a kind of therapy. His methods were aimed at giving philosophy peace by dissolving the problems themselves.
Not solving them, but showing they weren't real problems to begin with.
Exactly. Showing they arise from bewitchment by language, from misunderstandings of our conceptual grammar. He wasn't trying to build a better theory. He was trying to cure us of the need for certain kinds of theories by getting a clear view of how our language actually works, untangling the knots.
So, James the mediator, Wittgenstein the therapist, both seeking clarity and a return to sanity, but through very different means.
Well put. And yet, on the topic of meaning, there's that striking affinity again. Wittgenstein's later slogan, "Meaning is use," sounds incredibly pragmatic. He even notes something like the usefulness, i.e. the use, gives the proposition its special sense.
That sounds almost exactly like James.
It does. James's pragmatic principle of significance was precisely that. The meaning of any idea lies in the practical consequences it points towards, the conduct it is fitted to produce.
How did James apply that?
Famously to religious or metaphysical claims, he argued that abstract attributes of God, like being necessary or immaterial, are basically meaningless, destitute of all intelligible significance, unless they make some concrete difference to our lives, to our experiences or actions.
So, if believing God is necessary doesn't change how you pray or act or see the world, then the word necessary in that context is just an empty sound.
That's James's pragmatic test for significance. And interestingly, Wittgenstein later seemed to adopt a similar view regarding religious language. He suggested it gets its sense, its meaning, not from describing some supernatural fact, but from its role in organizing life, structuring experience, shaping how people live.
It's use within a form of life.
Exactly. So in a way, Wittgenstein ends up being a pragmatist about meaning linking sense to use and practice, even while fiercely rejecting James's pragmatism as a theory of truth. The idea that truth simply is usefulness.
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction, meaning versus truth. Okay, this leads us to maybe the deepest divide. Their fundamental outlooks, their temperaments. Wittgenstein was quite pessimistic, conservative.
Deeply so. He had almost no sympathy for the direction of modern Western civilization, the belief in progress. He saw the scientific industrial age potentially as the beginning of the end for humanity.
Wow, that's dark.
It is. He felt alienated from his time. His philosophical aim wasn't to build grand new systems or contribute to progress. It was more like trying to get a clear view of the foundations, maybe tidy up the building site, but not necessarily start construction. He distrusted grand schemes.
He wanted clarity, not construction.
Compare that with James. James was brimming with, well, American optimism, perhaps, an adventurous spirit. He embraced the uncertainty of the universe. He was willing to take the universe to be really dangerous and adventurous without therefore backing out and crying no play. His outlook was forward-looking, aiming to actively shape a better future, to overcome evil.
And this wasn't just abstract optimism. James had concrete, large-scale social ideas, didn't he? Like the moral equivalent of war.
Yes, and this perfectly illustrates the temperamental gulf. James proposed this idea. Basically, a universal conscription of youth, not for military service, but for hard labor.
Conscription for labor.
Yeah, sending privileged young people off to work in coal mines, on fishing boats, building infrastructure tough, character-building work against nature. The idea was to instill discipline, civic virtue, and toughness, providing the moral benefits of war without the actual killing. A vast social engineering project.
Okay, I can immediately see how Wittgenstein would react to that.
Right.
A huge, top-down, progressive scheme to reshape society and character.
It would have been absolute anathema to him. It embodies everything he distrusted about modernity's ambition and belief in systemic solutions. Wittgenstein wanted individual clarity. Jones wanted collective progress through deliberate, large-scale action. Their shared focus on action led them in completely opposite directions when it came to society.
So we come full circle. The paradox holds. Wittgenstein deeply respected James, the careful observer, the describer of life's particularities. He learned from him.
Yes, they shared that aversion to abstraction, that commitment to looking at practice, at use. James was a real human being describing real human complexities.
But ultimately, they stood on different sides of a fundamental logical divide. James remained the empiricist, grounding everything, even logic, back in psychology and experience.
While Wittgenstein moved toward seeing logic and concepts as grammatical rules, norms embedded in our forms of life, setting standards rather than just describing facts. Necessity for him wasn't in the brain's wiring, but in the pattern, in the weave of our life.
Which brings us back to that unsettling foundation. We started by seeing how, for Wittgenstein, our most basic certainties, the hinges aren't products of reason. They aren't even beliefs in the usual sense. They're grounded in action, in instinct.
Right. They stand fast not because they're proven, but because they're simply part of how we live. It is there like our life, as he put it, an ungrounded, non-rational foundation.
So here's the thought to leave you with. If the very bedrock of our certainty, the ground upon which all our reasoning and knowledge is built, is ultimately just this instinctive, animal way of acting, what does that really mean for our grand philosophical quest for rational truth?
If the foundation isn't reasoned, but just lived, can philosophy ever truly escape being, in some deep sense, a description of our biological and social conditioning? What does that do to the idea of objective, rational knowledge?
A profound question stemming from this complex relationship. Thanks for joining us for this